think around the time that much of the development of this church, there was this, they believed that they saw three suns rising in the sky, which was supposed to represent the three sons of York,
Right.
which was at the, beginning of the Wars of the Roses. So you had Richard, George and Edward, late Edward IV. And that was the whole, it was this sort of thing, well, we saw three suns rising in the sky, that's an omen, that the three sons of York. And I mean, who knows what that could have been? It could have literally just been, as you say, some kind of celestial event.
Welcome to the Champing Podcast. You may be thinking, huh? And what sort of word is that? To which I answer, it is a combination of the words church and camping, and it amuses me no end. Champing is a unique concept of camping overnight in historic churches brought to the world by the Churches Conservation Trust, the national charity protecting redundant churches. Over 10,000 of happy champers have stayed in their churches that are dotted all over England. So in this podcast series, we embark on our very own sleepover, but with a twist. Each week I invite a new sleepover guest to join me, Victoria Jenner, to spend a night within ancient walls. Together we explore the secrets of a new church and the mysteries it inspires. Climbing atop a steep hill, looming over the rural village of Langport in Somerset, stands All Saints Church, our church for this last episode. It is an impressive building, boasting an immense tower and a multitude of what is called Hunky Punks. And so this church was built in the late 15th and 16th centuries mainly, but it is still testament to this grand late Middle Ages heritage. The east window is home to the biggest collection of stained glass in all of Somerset, illustrating the saints in all of their gloriously coloured robes with animated and peaceful demeanours. So it is fair to say that All Saints Church is as enchanting as it is awe-inspiring. To celebrate its medieval identity in our last episode of the series, I am joined by some great speakers. Historian Helen Carr, local astronomer Paul Adamson, who will delight us with a session of stargazing, and we also welcome an English heritage expert. So let's travel back to Langport in the late Middle Ages. So I'm so excited to be here. I've just been dropped off by a taxi and it's very, very remote. And I'm at Mulchaney Abbey, and it's otherwise known as the Great Island Monastery. Mulchaney Abbey lies in a watery landscape, which I have come to via winding country roads. It is 2 miles south of Langport and 20 miles from Glastonbury, and was once a thriving monastic site, yet now sits in ruin, remote and quiet, like a little island in the centre of the Somerset Levels. I spoke to senior properties historian for English Heritage, Michael Carter, to learn more about the history of the site.
And if you go outside, there's nothing left of the church. There's just this imprint of the church. You can see where the Anglo-Saxon church was, quite diminutive, quite small, when you see what it's replaced by after the Norman conquest, and building works continue on the church right up until the 14th century. It was probably being remodeled, into the 16th as well. A lot of the cloister buildings are gone as well. For instance, the chapter house where the monks would have gathered for their daily meeting, and above it would have been the dormitory range. But what we do have at Mulchaney is an incredible sequence of buildings, which was used by the abbot, including his, what we call his parlour or his chamber. And attached to that was a kind of long gallery that would have connected his hall and his chambers with the monks' dormitory in the East Range. There are 2 wonderful kitchens created out of a single kitchen in the 14th century, around about the time when monks get the right to eat meat a few times a week. And I think that would have necessitated the creation of a meat kitchen, as well as a kitchen for use on other days. Now, the rule of St. Benedict, which regulated life at Mulchaney, is very strict. It says that monks can't eat meat in the refectory. So they get around by that by not eating meat in the refectory, by eating it in another room, which you might be able to see at Muchelney as well. As a room that used to get interpreted as just a lobby, or at one point a bit like a Roman villa, the summer dining room. But in actual fact, I think it was probably the misericorde where the monks ate meat 3 times a week. But they needed a separate kitchen for that as well. It's wonderful, wonderful worn stairway leading from the ground floor of the kitchen range and joining where the misericorde is, and leading up this wonderful staircase with a little turn at the top leading to the abbot's parlour, which I think probably would have been used for ceremonial occasions rather than for his daily relaxation and leisure. It has this wonderful fireplace in it, this wonderful ceiling, probably original to the room from around about 1430 to 1450, and some fragments of stained glass, medieval stained glass in the windows, including the monogram of an abbot there in the 15th century. And indeed, elsewhere at Muchelney, you can see these fragments of medieval stained glass, possibly reset from the church or elsewhere. And then also in the long gallery I talked about just a few moments ago, some absolutely wonderful wall paintings imitating expensive textile hangings, and some of them show the influence of the continental Renaissance. Muchelney was no backwater, and that's also shown by the remains of the cloister. Only the south range remains, but this wonderful cloister which would have had fan vaulting on the pattern of Gloucester Cathedral. A small monastery, we're only talking about 20, 30 monks or so. That's pretty okay, actually, for a mid-ranking monastery in the late Middle Ages. But boy, was it architecturally impressive. And it also, I think, would have been spiritually impressive as well. Yes, there were ups and downs. For instance, Brother John Langport, who in the 1450s is admonished by the local bishop, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, for his gluttony and drunkenness and for swearing by the limbs of Christ. But more than balancing that is evidence of the spiritual vibrancy of the monks. And it very quickly becomes embroiled in the 1530s in Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. The king and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, start meddling in the affairs of the monastery in the 1530s. The elderly abbot just isn't up to it as far as Cromwell's concerned. And he gets replaced by a young chap who may well not even be old enough to be properly elected abbot. You've got to be at least 25 years old, and there are some claims he hasn't reached what's called the canonical age. Anyway, Muchelney comes to an end in 1538. The church and many of the cloistral buildings are immediately reduced to ruins, and in fact, they're not rediscovered until the 19th century. Well, another building that survived the dissolution of Muchelney was the monastic latrines, or to give it its medieval term, the necessarium, where the monks would go. Monks were meant to be very, very regular. The rule of St. Benedict, which governed life at Muchelney, said that monks were to attend to the necessities of nature between the early morning offices of matins and lauds. And to do that, they built a very, very large block, the monastic latrines, the necessarium, or the rara daughter, as it starts to get called in the 15th century. And it survives the dissolution of the monasteries, and you can still see the fittings where the monk's latrine bench would have been partitioned off, the strict rules about how monks were meant to behave while sitting on the loo, and decorum was meant to be observed at all time. But the waste would drop down, or gosh, to the floor beneath into a drain. Now, despite the watery landscape, Muchelney doesn't have a stream running through it. It was supplied with water by a conduit, and that just didn't have the force to flush the loos, as was the case at a lot of other monasteries. So there's these 5 arches where the monastic servants every so often would have had to go in with a shovel to muck out the latrines. That would have been valuable fertilizer for the monastery's crops.
And so I decided to explore the thatched monk's lavatory, the only one of its kind in Britain. Oh gosh, yes, there they are. And now there is a slight sort of window, which means that everyone would have seen your behind, if that was the case now. I mean, it smells considerably better, I'm guessing, than it would have done back in the day. So I've just been walking through this lovely town of Langport, and it's absolutely thriving with people, with shops. It's lovely, but it still retains this medieval character, which is really special. Oh, so I'm just walking up a very steep hill to the church, and for someone who I would like to think is quite fit, I do do quite a bit of running. Even for me, it's quite tiring. Oh, I can see it now in sight. Finally, let's get in and say hello to Helen. I can see Helen. Hello, Helen.
Hello. It's
Hi.
nice to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too. How was your journey here?
It was good, actually. It was really good. I managed to get, I'm writing a book at the moment, and I managed to actually get some writing done. Something about writing on trains. I feel very productive.
Helen Carr is an award-nominated writer, historian and podcaster, specialising in medieval history and public history. She is also the author of best-selling book, The Red Prince, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, which was published in 2021. So tell me, when you first look at the church, what do you see?
Well, I think like lots of churches, you see all the layers of history, and you see how they have been restored and repaired, and it's like every century makes its stamp on a church, isn't it? So you have little features which identify it to a particular era, and then you've got additions. So I think some of this church has definitely got some 19th century additions, and I think the tower looks particularly new. I think that's definitely been restored. I mean, beautifully restored. Still in a fairly, it's got Gothic elements to it, but it is 19th century.
The stone is so much lighter, isn't it? In contrast,
the stone's lighter. Yeah, it is, and it just looks much neater, much less weather beaten, and so that's quite clear. But then you have these little sort of features that I love about churches. Whenever I go to a church, I look for them, and there's these little corbels, which are these little heads that sort of poke out from the walls, particularly around the windows. And there's this lovely arched window here, and you've got a couple of these really well preserved corbels. I think one of them might have been restored actually on the right side, but on the left, that's when they start. All the rain over the centuries has sort of eroded the stone, and you just get really just this sort of very basic features of a human face. And I think that does remind you of the humanity attached to these places, and how they were very much part of people's lives and lived experiences. And I think that's a wonderful little feature in churches that I love to look for.
Absolutely.
And you get men and women. It's not just men on these corbels, not the faces of just men. You get female faces, and you get sort of gargoyles, and you get some wonderful expressions. But I like
fantastical beasts.
You do get from these fantastical beasts, but I think it's the sort of everyday people that I like to see. And who they might be attributed to, whether it's the master builders. Often that's the case, that they'd be modelled on people who are actually involved in the construction of the church, or members of their families, and those are the things I really love about churches.
These intricately carved figures jutting out from the corners of the pinnacles, their grotesque faces twisted in serene and elegant expressions, hark back to Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was once Lady of the Manor and a major political figure in the Wars of the Roses. The portcullis, a strong heavy grating that can be lowered down with grooves on each side of a gateway to block it. You usually find them on medieval castles. This held special significance for Lady Margaret, her son Henry VII, and grandson Henry VIII, who all used it as their emblem. The presence of these carvings and symbols hints at a rich but bloody history tied to these very walls of this ancient fortress-like church. So for listeners, could you just explain what is medieval, what is the period, and can you give a bit of context for the time?
That's a really good question. Some people would start the medieval period literally after the collapse of Latin Christendom. So you're talking a really long time ago, like the 6th century. The period that I studied, the period of medieval history I would call the early medieval period, sort of pre-1066. So you're talking about the Saxons, the Vikings. That for me that would be more early medieval, but then you'd have high medieval, late medieval would be from 1066 onwards, which is the period I study, up until probably, I would say, for me it's probably the Tudors, the rise of the Tudors, the Reformation, probably pre-Reformation. But for some reason in my mind, the latest medieval goers will probably be Henry VII. There's something about the Henry VIII and the Reformation that sort of takes it into the early modern for me.
So it's a vast period.
It's a really big period.
Really big.
And the thing is, there is no real definitive, time. And it's a bit of a misnomer. People kind of just call, some people take medieval into the early 17th century, which I think is not quite, I wouldn't go that far. But for me, it is very much that, I would say stopping around the Reformation, if not before.
The suppression of the monasteries seems like quite a good definitive point to stop that period at.
Yeah,
so...
I think so. I think it's when you had a lot of scholarly thinking that was starting to emerge with the rise of Luther and figures like that really threw all of the traditional ways of practicing faith. It really threw it into a different light and really threw people, and it really embarked on what I would call a series of wars of religion that occurred into the early modern.
This church is dated back to 1202 and it was a chapelry of Huish episcopacy, and it has a stone carving from the late 12th century on its south door that is very emblematic of this period. And we know that anti-clerical lollards also preached in the chapel, and the churchyard was reconsecrated after being defiled by bloodshed in 1415. Do you know more about this period, like what was happening at this time?
Yeah, so the Lollard movement started to emerge in the later 14th century, particularly under a man called John Wycliffe, who was a theologian from Oxford. And he started to get support in the royal family. So you had quite a lot of the higher order members of nobility starting to support this idea and of Lollardy. And he was actually dubbed the flower of the Reformation. So it's really the sort of seeds of the reformer thought were around Wycliffe. So it's this idea that the Bible should be translated into the vernacular. They had real problems with clerical wealth. So you see the sort of pattern that comes into the later Protestant movements. That's kind of where it emerged. And initially, people always had a problem with it. It caused a massive rupture within the church, and obviously the Catholic Church really did not support this movement. It was not in their interest at all to support it. But it didn't cause so much angst and bloodshed in the 14th century. It was only when it started to gain pace and become a real threat to the Catholic Church later into the 15th and 15th century. And then obviously when you get figures later in the 16th century who are having the same, bringing out the same ideas, that it became a real problem and the wars of religion started. So it had its roots in the later 14th century, but yeah, like all these wars of religion, when you have two opposing schools of thought over something that is so personal and deep-rooted within what it is to be human and alive in the medieval period, it's going to result in this sort of bitter conflict, like anything in history when it comes to religious thought has done.
As time went on, Langport was still considered a chapel of Huish episcopacy, but during the 16th to 18th centuries, the town officials tried different ways to improve church services. They hired organ players and singers and even paid preachers to give talks or sermons. And in 1670, they even made a plan to march together to church every Sunday to encourage people to attend. And that's fascinating that we have part of that history, part of that narrative being brought to life in this very spot and inside this church. Should we go in and have a look?
Yes.
Stepping inside All Saints, one is immediately entranced by its sheer size, and we marvel at the tall medieval stained glass windows that stretch to the rafters. The soft coloured light spilling in from these windows creates a peaceful atmosphere. Padded camp beds and bucket-style chairs are set up in the south chapel, along with a storage chest for bags and other items. A few strands of fairy lights, battery candles, and lanterns light up areas of the chapel and add to the warm ambience.
So I think I was talking about doors before, and something I really love about churches is the old doors, and because you really do get impressions of people who have walked through this doorway, often in these doors by all these different marks. And there's this church near the Anglo-Scottish border that actually still has axe marks from the Scots attacking the church, and it's still sort of indented probably from the late 13th, early 14th century. So I always look at doors and see what you can find, and just all of the markings, and you've got all of this beautiful kind of foliate decoration. So yeah, I think doors are a wonderful part of a church that often are sometimes like the oldest parts of a church as well.
And sometimes overlooked, I think, if you're just seeing it sort of a gateway in. But I mean, here it's interesting because it almost replicates window tracery, doesn't it? It just looks like lots of windows.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then it sort of ascends up to this, as you say, this foliate type imagery.
Yeah. It's beautiful. And then coming in, there's this lovely vaulted ceiling, which I think is 15th century.
There are other parts of the church which are also steeped in late medieval grandeur. Helen has indeed noticed the south door, adorned with intricate perpendicular panelling and delicate foliage carvings, which leads to a stunning interior featuring a fan vault ceiling reminiscent of St. Peter and St. Paul's Church near the ruins of Mulchaney Abbey, dating back to 1490. More remnants of the late medieval era can also be found throughout the church, from the now blocked priest's doorway on the chancel south side to the ornately carved wooden ceilings, complete with intersecting beams and intricately detailed bosses. And let us not forget about the octagonal font, an impressive piece that replaced an old font stone which church wardens sold in 1589 after it had been lying waste in the churchyard.
But, originally in the medieval period, the church would have been elaborately painted. There would have been all of these different scenes of the life of the Passion of Christ, the life of Christ. It would have been such a vibrant experience. We'd be smelling incense. It would be, it would be more noisy because you'd get more people in here. It's definitely, it's been obviously in the Reformation, everything was whitewashed and things were plastered over, but you still find some beautiful medieval wall paintings also that have survived over the centuries in these sorts of places. So thinking of it in that sense as well is quite extraordinary. But I suppose it's similar to the stained glass, and this church has several beautiful stained glasses. And I think all of that is really meant to evoke the sensory experience of being inside a church, particularly for people living in the medieval period, because, when they walked into these places, it was meant to be, you are in the realm of God. It's supposed to evoke every single sense within you. That's why you have the incense, and you've got the bright lights with the stained glass and the colours on the walls, and the chanting. I can imagine it just being this incredibly evocative experience. And then you've got, all of the very personal physical impressions on churches. So every element of a church, if you look closely, has somebody who has invested in something within it. And part of that was to have an enduring legacy within a church, because that was a way of committing yourself to God. It was also, minimizing your time in purgatory by giving money or giving alms to a church. And people would set up chanceries, or even simple things like having, dedicating pews to churches or building a window. And obviously people wanted to be memorialized in churches, and we're standing on an example of that. There's all of these monumental brasses and all these memorial brasses in the floor, and some of them are stone, but sometimes you do get the actual surviving brasses as well.
I mean, we're surrounded by quite a few here, aren't we?
Yeah.
So 1, 2, 3,
I
4,
think
5,
most
6,
of
around 10.
These are 17th century. You've got someone who died here in 1665, so that could potentially have been a plague death, maybe. Because obviously the plague was 1665. The 17th century plague was, not the 14th century plague. But yeah, I think there's an interesting fact about the ones we're standing on here are stone, but in some of these churches you do get the brasses. And talking of plague and brasses, and possibly the reason for these stones as well, for some of them perhaps, is when you have so many people who are dying of plague who want to be memorialised, a really quick way of doing that for the people who could afford it was to use brasses rather than actually build stone monuments, because they literally just didn't have the craftsmen to build enough stone monuments for the people who were dying and needed to be memorialised.
Well, on that rather macabre and chilling note, let's reflect on the fact that the church is indeed a living testament to the power and influence of two prominent local families, the Stuckeys of Stuckeys Bank and the Bajats. As Helen has noticed, their legacies are etched into every corner, from towering stained glass windows to intricate wall monuments. As the sun streams through the western window, it casts a golden glow over the final resting place of Walter Bajat, who you may know as the famed economist and constitutional expert who died in 1877.
So just, thinking about the families that dominated regions, when William the Conqueror came over in 1066 and he bought, hundreds of these Norman barons, he granted them all land across the country. So you had some of these incredibly old families who were rooted within a particular area, and their money and their wealth and title and privilege sort of filtered down through generations. And you really do see examples of it in these spaces, because these are the spaces that they invested it into. If they weren't castle building, they were building churches. That's why you have so many of these Norman churches that were surviving, because the Normans did go on this, massive church and property building project, really. I mean, they built so much around the country that still survives today. I mean, obviously the Tower of London being the most famous one, but churches are something that they did invest in heavily. And so you do get these little sort of snippets of detail in these churches as to who some of these families were. And if you trace these families back, a lot of them have French names, or they sound slightly French, and that's because they came over with William the Conqueror, normally.
Just to navigate everybody, we're going to walk now towards the pews. And this is what's quite special about this church. We do still have the pews here, whereas in most churches now they've even been removed because of damp or they're rotting. But if we move around here to the other stained glass windows, to the transept, we can find all of the camping materials. So we have our brilliant camp beds here, all laid out.
I've got my eye on that hot water bottle.
I know, I think it might get a bit cold tonight. Bow Street, thought to be built by Romans for safe passage over River Parrett, saw chaos during Oliver Cromwell's pursuit of retreating soldiers in 1645. It became a trade hub thanks to Stuckey and Bajat's river trade, making it the busiest and most desirable location in town. Pubs and beer houses flourished to serve boatmen and traders, including the infamous Langport Arms, which underwent name changes before settling on back to the original title. Tonight, we find ourselves in one of Bow Street's many historic pubs. So, we've just had a lovely meal. Did you enjoy your food?
It was very nice. It was perfect. I feel like it was the perfect sort of warming meal for what's probably going to be quite a cold
evening. Hopefully it won't be too cold. We do have our woolly socks, don't we?
And a hot water bottle, which I'm very much looking forward to. I get quite attached to a hot water bottle in winter.
So I have to pry it away from you in the morning.
Yeah.
It just made me think, just whilst we're sitting here, when it's quite an old looking building, isn't it really? Like, there's been, of course, a lot of restoration work in here, so we can't exactly date it. But it made me think, well, how did medieval people respond to the local pub? Like, was there such a thing as a pub back in the medieval period?
Definitely. I think people very much like to commune and have a few drinks. Lots of drinks. I mean, there are lots of sources. Usually in court records, actually, of people being incredibly drunk and disorderly and doing stupid things because they've had far too much to drink. Like, there was a record of somebody going to urinate in a pond and accidentally falling in and drowning because he was so drunk, and all sorts of misdemeanours like that.
And talking of hilariously drunken accidents, our conversation very naturally turns to Geoffrey Chaucer, well known for pulling together the Canterbury Tales in the late 1300s. He was seen as a patron of sociability and good cheer, who usually depicted archetypal characters like the drunken miller Robin who requites the Knight's Tale. He is just one of Chaucer's pilgrim storytellers who gather in the Tabard Inn in Southwark, just south of the River of London, to go on pilgrimage to Canterbury.
Well, Chaucer was, he was sort of a jack of all trades when it came to what he wrote about. Obviously, he wrote these incredible pieces of prose like the Canterbury Tales, which were, we all know very well. But he also was very interested in science, and one of the pieces of work that he wrote was a treatise on the astrolabe, which is a sort of device. It was like a two-dimensional device to basically map the celestial sky. And stargazing was something that was considered an art and a science in the 14th century, and people took it very seriously. So yeah, I'm looking forward to doing that.
Well, shall we head back to the church and give it a go?
Yeah, why not?
We head back up the hill to All Saints, a 10-minute walk, and we are struck by the star-studded sky. During the medieval period, astronomy, or astrology as the two terms were interchangeable at this time, was a major focus of study for people. Unlike most people today, the average person had a vast knowledge of celestial phenomena. With limited access to tools such as clocks and almanacs and charts depicting the movements of the stars and planets, people relied on their very own observations to guide their daily routines. This is my colleague Helen.
Hello, nice to meet you. How are you doing?
And this is Paul,
Hi.
who has very kindly come down there, and he's only 2 minutes away, which I found out, which I feel so much better about, because I thought if you were travelling across Somerset.
Are you joking? I said to my wife, they said they'd pay perched, and I said, I wouldn't use any. Posting.
So who best to experience reading the night sky than with the chairman of the Somerset Levels Stargazers, Paul Adamson? I mean, we are pretty much away from all of the lights now, aren't we?
Directly above.
Yeah. Because what we've seen now, funny enough, looking this way, we're looking south, so over kind of that direction, to sort of the southeast, you see a really bright object in the sky, and that's Jupiter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's unmistakable, and actually it's next month is what they call opposition. It's when it's opposite the sun from the Earth at midnight. That's on November the 5th, I think that is.
Brilliant.
So it's its best appearance for the year. And the great thing about Jupiter, if you've got a telescope, you can see there's like equatorial bands, it's got storms on Jupiter, and you can see the great red spot.
Oh, wow.
But even with a pair of binoculars like we've got here, you can see the four major moons, which are Io, Europa, Ganymede and Callisto. And it's interesting, if you watch those each night, because they change position, you can kind of see the idea that they're orbiting, around the planet, and that's just with a pair of binoculars.
And I mean, you've got two pairs of binoculars here. Can you tell us a bit about them?
Yeah, so I've got one pair which are by a company called Opticon. They make excellent telescopes and binoculars. And I bought these for £85. I said that was about 20 years ago now. So £100. You spend hundreds on binoculars, thousands. But at the other end of the scale, I also have a pair of 10 by 50 binoculars from Lidl, which cost £14.99.
I mean, when visibility isn't great, like we have a bit of cloud here tonight, it can be a bit difficult to see the expanse of what's on offer here.
Such a shame, because I say this if it was, you'd see Jupiter, for example.
Wow.
And then behind that, you see the constellation of Taurus would be rising, Taurus the bull.
Yeah.
And you see the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters star cluster.
I'd be interested, because I'm a medieval historian, and I'd be interested to know what you think people in the Middle Ages, particularly before, the advancement of scientific knowledge about what the stars were and how they managed to kind of use the stars, I suppose, as a way of calculating where they were in the world, the time, the sort of the seasons.
It's funny enough, I did, is it the beginning of this year? No, a couple of years back, we do talks at our astronomy meetings. We have what to look for in the night sky during the month ahead.
Yeah.
A talk by a member of our committee or a guest speaker, and then all the latest news at the end. But what I'm saying is that a couple of years ago I did a talk about Stonehenge.
Oh, yeah.
And the point of view of, was it an ancient observatory? And also in the respect of, you're right, they knew when that star left the horizon, that's when we plant this, or when that's there, that's that.
Which I think they took very seriously.
Absolutely,
You know, it was
yeah.
something that really governed the way people existed through the seasons, and they used the stars in the same way as we'd see the months now. They would sort
Absolutely,
of
yeah.
chart like where you were in the.
I mean, we're kind of shielded from all that now, and obviously with the, our light pollution, things like that. Some people have never seen a proper night sky, so you do rely on all that, the other things to know what time of year it is, what season it is. Whereas with the stars, you would just know by that, and that's one of the most natural way of anything, isn't it?
It's bizarre how humanity has changed. In the Middle Ages, they were always looking up, whereas now it feels like we're
That's
always
true,
looking
yeah.
down
That's
at our
very true,
phones,
actually.
or
Yeah.
you know, our everyday lives is they're very different to how it was back then.
And also things like eclipses and comets and things like that. Even into, you're saying, to medieval times, they were kind of signs of danger or doom. And strangely enough, I mean, the one that appeared, Halley's Comet, in 1066,
Yes,
was in the Bayeux Tapestry, and I always think
precipitated the coming of the Normans.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and I always say, and people say, no. Well, I said, but did you realise that Comet Neowise, the last brightest comet, was just after the pandemic? I said,
Interesting.
I said, but there's nothing in that. But it's funny how these things sort of tie together, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So you can imagine that people at the time didn't understand that it's just nothing to do with anything, but to them, it must mean something.
Well, exactly, and I think around the time that much of the development of this church, there was this. They believed that they saw 3 suns rising in the sky, which was supposed to represent the 3 sons of York,
Right.
which was at the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. So you had Richard, George, and Edward, later Edward IV, and that was the whole. It was this sort of thing. Well, we saw 3 suns rising in the sky. That's an omen that these, the 3 sons of York. And I mean, who knows what that could have been? It could have literally just been, as you say, some kind of celestial event. But in their minds, that precipitated this really big juncture in their political history.
As we say goodbye to Paul and get ready for the night ahead, we ponder on how astronomy was experienced by the medieval person. Bless you. Thank you very much.
It goes well anyway.
Thank you very much. You too. Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night. I hope you sleep well.
You too. Hope you don't get scared by the face up ahead.
Oh yeah, there's this sort of creepy ceiling rosette with the slightly weird gargoyle type face in it. Unfortunately, I can't see it now.
That's good, yeah, since the lights have been turned off.
Yeah, exactly.
He's like got his tongue sticking out, hasn't he? And looks very Green Man-like.
It's not great.
Hopefully we won't have any dreams about the Green Men. See you in the morning.
See you in the morning.
Morning, everyone.
Morning.
How did you sleep?
Probably better than I thought I would. I think it was a very light sleep. I definitely woke up a few times sort of aware of where I was and aware of strange noises and actually just how echoey it is. The tiniest sound really echoes, doesn't it?
It really amplifies.
It picks up everything.
Yeah. Right, should we head on out?
Yes.
I mean, you can see so much more in the morning light.
I know, exactly. And actually, I did notice when I was coming out earlier to brush my teeth, that there is I think this is 12th century, this frieze that's above the doorway. And it's a pretty, I wouldn't say it's particularly decorative, but it's beautiful and it's incredibly simple. And it's the Agnus Dei, who's the Lamb of God. And if you look really closely, it's got a little halo around its head with the crucifix up the centre. And it's enclosed with a circle with 2 angels flanking either side. And then I think these are probably two saints, but because of over time and weather and age, they've just been sort of so, it's been quite weather beaten, so you can't really see any particular detail
But even though it's sort of fairly rudimentary, it's just really beautiful.
Absolutely. I mean, as you say, it's quite minimalistic, but the fact that it still survives today and you can still see what the depiction is, the relief is still there.
Yeah.
It's remarkable to think that it survived all of this time since the 12th century.
Yeah, so this would be probably one of the earliest parts of the church. And I think we were talking about that yesterday, about how these doorways were often sort of part of the real medieval construct of the church. And if you think about how part of the service happened here, you would, this would be a fine example of what people would be looking at when, as the service was being conducted for them. So I think that's really lovely, a lovely thing to notice in the morning light, especially as it stands out, particularly in that sort of orange sandstone that's quite, unique to this particular church.
Absolutely, and we have these big oak doors open, and now we're walking out into the churchyard, and I mean, wow, look at that view, it's incredible. I didn't really notice
the
it
mist
much.
like lifting off the landscape. It's beautiful.
It really is, and we can see in the distance Mulchaney Abbey's tower and church spire.
Yeah.
So that's incredible, the fact that the rolling landscape on all of these, but we are very much set above everything, aren't we? We're on a hill.
Yeah.
So
We
can
start
see
our day early and head out to Langport for some breakfast. This lovely town is full of independent businesses, with the High Street a past nominee for Best British High Street Awards. It is really bustling this morning, with a local farmers market installed in the main High Street, which is where we now find ourselves.
And do you feel that as a medieval historian that you feel connected to the church, or you've seen it in another way?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it made me think about the common practice of pilgrims sort of travelling these really popular pilgrim routes, how churches would be a safe space for them, how they would come and they would rest in churches, they would sleep in churches. So I suppose it's sort of going back to the roots of what a church used to be to people in the Middle Ages.
Amazing. Well, please do come back soon. Thank you.
Promise I'll do that.
And if you would like to become a medieval pilgrim for a night or two, like many of our guest speakers, why not give Champing a try? For everything you need to know about Champing, you can visit champing.co.uk. The Champing season happens in those warmer months between March and October, so book now. Thank you for joining me on my Champing adventure. This Nights in the Nave podcast has been written and produced by me, Victoria Jenner. My guest has been historian Helen Carr, and big thanks also go to Michael Carter from English Heritage and the English Heritage custodians at Mulchaney Abbey, who were so accommodating. Plus, we cannot forget to mention Paul Adamson from the Somerset Levels Stargazing Society. Special thanks also goes to Fiona Silk, who runs Champing, and all of our Champing assistants. Sound recording was managed by Leanne Beattie, editing by Jamie Reed Sound, music by Nick Very, and designed by George Allen. This has been a Churches Conservation original podcast. Come to a sleepover at our place.